So far, we're talking about church history, right? The definition of church history is the story of God's faithfulness in the gospel to his people throughout time. The story of God's faithfulness in the gospel to his people throughout time. We have discussed kind of the first 300 years of the church and how that first 300 years are marked by persecution, mostly. And this included periods of very intense persecution and more mild persecution. We saw that all that changed in the year 313, talked about last week. In the year 313, what happened in 313, if anyone remembers that was here from the notes or just memory? What? Constantine took control, yeah. Yes, state religion. Yes. Edict of Milan is what I was looking for, but you're right. It was due to Constantine taking control. The Edict of Milan. And basically this legalized Christianity, right? So Christianity went from the persecuted, outcast religion to a favored religion, right? A kind of put forward, a kind of state-approved religion. And this is a big deal, right? Because this greatly increased the number of Christians in the empire, mostly ended the persecutions, and kind of changes this relationship of the church, right, and the government or the state. So, with these two things kind of coming together, the church and the state kind of meshing together, some issues kind of come around, right, where church issues now kind of become political issues, right? And this is the first time we've seen this, where political issues start to affect the church more. So this gave rise to a series of state government-sanctioned ecumenical church councils we talked about last week. The four big ones that we talked about were the Council of Nicaea. Wait, that's the wrong one. Nicaea in 325. And this was really about what we call the Arian controversy. The Arian controversy. And basically Arius was a guy, and he had a theory. He was putting forth the idea that Jesus was not co-equal with God, right? He was a created being, right? Kind of the first created being. And so there was controversy over this heresy. And so they got together in Nicaea. Constantine calls a council to figure it out because it's getting political, right? Because of Edict of Milan, this issue becomes political. So they get everybody together, and the first time the entire empire from all over coming together to argue about mainly this idea. And so they put forward the Nicene Creed, and they reject Arianism and Arius. And so that kind of is helpful, but it doesn't squash the problem. So about 50 years later, we have the Council of Constantinople. In 381. So Arian controversy kind of continues until the Council of Constantinople. These are cities too. Nicaea and Constantinople are both cities. Where it's kind of finally settled, right? Arius has died by this point, but Arianism is kind of squashed officially at Constantinople. Right, so then everything's going okay, but that kind of leads to the idea, okay, we figured out kind of who God is, how the Trinity works. If Christ is both God and man, how does that make sense? Right, so then we have kind of the Christ controversy, the Christological controversy, and there's two sides to that as well, of course. And then we have kind of one council to talk about this, the Council of Ephesus in 431. Right, and so the kind of two sides of trying to understand is he more God? Is it one kind of unity, or is it split into two? Kind of how do we figure this out? And that they meet at Ephesus to talk about it, and that doesn't really solve much. So 20 years later, we have Chalcedon in 451. And so this is kind of settles it, right? Where they leave it as kind of ambiguous, right? As kind of a mystery, right? Christ's nature, he is both one and he is two. And so that's kind of how we leave it, right? Because there's mystery in who God is. And trying to pick one over the other causes a lot of problems. So that's kind of where we stand. And these are kind of the main big four ecumenical councils and the creeds that come from them, right? The Nicene Creed, the Creed of Chalcedon. These are standard church practices, right? In order to be an Orthodox Christian, you agree with these councils, right? For the next 1,500 years, right? These are the standards of what we believe. All right. So that's kind of where we've been. Questions, comments on any of that?
So after that last council, how did they leave the divine and human thing?
Yeah. So they kind of leave it how. So Pope Leo, who's the head of the Bishop of Rome, he writes this tome, this letter, which is basically just restating what Tertullian said in 200 about the nature of Christ is both one and two. Right? He is both a unity, but divine, completely man. Right? There's not a split, but it's also not a merging, if that makes sense. So it's in a mysterious way in which these two come together. Right? So that's kind of how the orthodox position of who Christ is today. So, good question. We're good? All right, let's keep moving. And if you need a handout from last week, I can get it to you later. And that has some of the dates and more info. Okay, today we're going to start off with talking about kind of the more ripple effects of the Edict of Milan. And the first one we're going to talk about is monasticism, or the monastery. Monasticism. There are two important words that we're going to talk about when we talk about monasticism. First is monasticism, and next is asceticism, which is difficult to say, actually. Okay, monasticism and asceticism. First, monasticism, or monastic principles, or the monastery system. Monasticism is the process of separating oneself from the greater society for the purpose of spiritual devotion. Right? This involves the creation of monasteries, of convents, of religious orders, and almost always involves ascetic practices. Now, asceticism, or ascetic practices is the process of strict self-denial for the purpose of greater holiness. This often involves vows of chastity, vows of poverty, vows of silence, vows of service, long periods of fasting, self-mortification, and all that kind of stuff. Right? So kind of self-denial type practices are what we call asceticism or ascetic practices. So monasticism is kind of a separating, right, that involves ascetic practices. So with the Edict of Milan and the acceptance of Christianity into kind of the mainstream culture of society, mainstream politics, mainstream life of kind of the Roman Empire and people, what we see is a huge rise in monasticism. All right. Now, ascetics had kind of always been part of the Christian community. There'd always been people who had wanted to take, self-denial type practices. There's always men and women who chose to remain unmarried, or chose to live a life of poverty, or chose not to have possessions, or to devote themselves kind of completely to one thing, to one service, to prayer, to kind of these very, more extreme practices. So there'd always kind of been these people, and there'd been a place for them in the church, right? They'd been there. And we can even see the roots of it in when Paul, in some of his letters, he writes about some of these ideas. He actually encourages people not to marry, right? So he encourages this idea of chastity, vows of chastity, for all that are able. So this has always kind of been around in the church, these ideas. But when Christianity was illegal, right, there's already a distinction and separation from society, the church and society, right? There's very clear separation and distinction between these two things. And so, there's persecution and separation. So ascetics kind of weren't that weird, right? They were just kind of a part of the church culture, right? Because it wasn't that much further, right, to go a little more extreme when you were already choosing to be completely very separated from society as a whole, right? So it was already kind of a part of the process. But again, with the Edict of Milan, the acceptance and the huge rise in converts in the kind of the 300s and that time, there's a change that happens. Right? Some people don't like the legalization of the church. So some Christians don't like this. So we have this rise of new Christians, and a lot of these new Christians were untested. So soon the church began to look and act and kind of be involved more in the culture, right? The church and the culture became to be not that different, right? So some people didn't like this. Christians started to look like everyone else. And so, in protest to this blending of these two things, church and culture, many withdrew from culture and civilization, and even from the church community, right, to separate themselves from what they saw as and what they didn't like, and sought these more extreme ascetic practices. So we have the rise of the monastic movement. It's kind of this rebellion of the church from perceived compromise with the world. It's that kind of idea. So how does all this kind of come about? We usually trace the rise of monasticism to one guy, a monk named Anthony. Now, Anthony is sometimes called Anthony the Great or Anthony of the Desert. He lived from roughly 260 to 348-ish. 356, sorry. Different date there. Anyway, Anthony the Great or Anthony of the Desert. So right around the year 290 or 300, Anthony was deeply moved by the encounter that Jesus has with the rich young ruler in Matthew 19, right? So Jesus tells the rich young ruler, if you want to be perfect, go and sell all that you have and give to the poor, and then take up your, and then follow me, right? Come, follow me. Sell all you have and follow me. And so Anthony reads this passage in Matthew, and it like deeply impacts him. So he basically just does that, right? He just sells everything he has, and then goes off by himself into the desert of Egypt to be by himself. That's what he does, right? And there he just lives for the rest of his life. So for 50 years or whatever, he just was a hermit hanging out in the desert in Egypt by himself. And so he was actually really good friends with someone we talked about last week, Athanasius, if you remember him. And so they were friends. So Athanasius actually wrote a kind of biography of Anthony's story, and that was great for everyone, but it was not the best for Anthony. The problem for Anthony was he got popular, right? And so for him that was a negative because people kept coming to see him, and so he kept having to get further and further and further into the desert to be alone, right? Because that was what he was trying to do. But yeah, so he would come in sometimes to talk to Athanasius or do, whatever. He was against Arianism, so he would come in, because he was so popular, Athanasius would kind of ask him to come in and speak out against it and that kind of stuff. But, so that's kind of Anthony in his life, right? He became very popular. So Anthony is kind of accredited with starting what we call the solitude camp of monasticism, this solitude idea. Yes. So that's Anthony. So a little while later, 20 years later, we have a guy named Pachomius. He comes along. Pachomius. And he is from 292 to 384. 348. So like 20 years later, Pachomius comes along. And he begins kind of the community style of monasticism. So Anthony is about solitude. Pachomius comes along. He's like, I don't want to be completely by myself, just kind of by myself. Right? So he starts this community idea, the other end of that scale. And so this was not necessarily about solitude, but about kind of a complete obedience to a community, right? And the community's leader, which was called the abbot. Right, so you go off, kind of start your own community. You'd have this abbot, and you'd be like devoted to this community. And they would always involve kind of ascetic practices, right? Involved rejection of any self-expression, right? So they would all wear exactly the same clothes. Intense fasting is very common. Hard labor, self-mortification, right? Strict obedience to set rules and calendars and schedules and all that sort of stuff. So. And both these camps are very extreme, right? We're talking about really extreme versions of what we think of as monasteries, right? So very strict ascetic practices. It was even called by some slow suicide. It was so extreme, right? That's how intense the fasting and the work and the, commitment was. So very, very extreme. Thankfully, let me see my eraser. We have someone called Basil the Great who comes along a few years later. And Basil is a really important figure in general. Basil, 330 to 379. So Basil was a very important theologian. He's known as one of the Cappadocian fathers. So Cappadocia was an area in which he lived, kind of in South Turkey. So him and his brother Gregory and their other friend Gregory are known as the Cappadocian fathers. And they're very important theologically. They're really involved with kind of those councils we talked about and arguing for orthodoxy and that kind of thing. But he's also really well known for starting kind of another type of monasticism. So he brings kind of a more moderate form of monasticism because he saw the value of what these guys were doing and what was happening. He thought it was like separating from the world and doing these things could be good, right? There are positives here. But he thought it had gone a little too far, right? So he wanted to kind of take the communal approach, Pachomius, right? And kind of restructure it to make it a little more reasonable. But he was still very focused on kind of service and devotion, right? So similar ideas, but more doable, less slow suicide, and more livable, right? More people could actually do this. And so, very important. He kind of sets the stage for all of monasticism that we see kind of going forward. And finally, the figure I want to talk about for this is Benedict. And he's like a while later, so he's around 400. I didn't write down the dates. Benedict is important because his rule, the Benedict rule, or his method, becomes the foundation for the monastic movement in the West and the Catholic Church. So basically all Catholic monasteries, monks, convents, all those type of things are based on Benedict's principles. Right? And he's around 400. So that's why he's very, very influential on that side of what we know as like a monastery. It's very Benedict focused in his kind of principles. But he was very much based on Basil, right? So he was stealing mostly Basil's homework kind of a thing, right? So very, very, very similar ideas there. All right. Now, there are both good and bad things about monasticism, as you might kind of come to an opinion on. They did a lot of great work, right? Ton of evangelism, ton of service, a lot of scholarship, right? A lot of thinking and writing, a lot of things. That's very helpful for us, right? Because that's where we have a lot of monasteries is where we received copies of Scripture, copies of all these writings. So a lot of great work happening in the monastery. But they did push forward this idea of a more works-based, having kind of faith that would become a much bigger deal as we move into the Middle Ages. But so that becomes kind of a problem, right? And they were very extreme, so taking it to probably too far. So there does become kind of problematic, but good and bad with the monastery. I do want to kind of take this topic and kind of talk about something greater, something bigger than this, because I think we can all understand the motivation of a monastery and monasticism, right? Because Christianity at its core is a self-denial faith. Right, the call of Christ is to sacrifice, right? To take up our cross and follow Him. Right, that's the call. It's a self-denial, and we see that, right? Then all the examples all over Scripture. The apostles, the early church have great examples of this self-sacrifice, right? Of giving your life and lives and their deaths to kind of for the faith. So we can understand kind of this desire to kind of be self-sacrificed and to make a distinction between the world and the church. Right? That's understandable. We get that as Christians. But the question is monasticism the best way to make that distinction? Right? Is this the way to kind of separate the culture from the church? What is the best way to kind of maintain this distinction? Right? Should the church and the culture interact, and how should they interact? What's that relationship? And this is something the church has dealt with on and off for thousands of years, right? Since the very beginning. And so in the handout, I just wanted to bring up this is from a 20th century theologian, H. Richard Niebuhr. He wrote a book called Christ and Culture and created some categories to kind of help us talk about how the church has dealt with this, right? How do we understand the culture and the church interacting? So what we see, Christ and culture, and he kind of breaks it up into five different sections. And what we see is on the left, we have Christ against culture, on the left. right? And on the right, we have Christ of culture. So over here is like against culture. It's the really wanting to separate, kind of make a clear split, right? Complete separation of Christ and culture. And this is really the monastery, right, that we're talking about. This far on the left, Christ against culture. It's the monastery. It's the Amish. It's whatever your commune group who just goes off and does their own thing, right? It's that kind of thing. Very separated, very against. We want to completely cut it off. We don't want to be related. On the opposite side, we have Christ of culture, right? And this is kind of where saying we're Christ and culture, there is no tension, right? They can be one thing, right? This is a lot of liberal theology is in this camp. If hyper-political or trying to be hyper-relevant type groups are in that category, right? There's no tension, right? We're one and the same. Christ of culture. And like, if we go kind of then one in, we have a paradox. Christ and culture and paradox. And then one in here on the other side, we have Christ above culture. And then here we have transformer of culture. So this is kind of wanting to be separate. Christ and culture and paradox is wanting to be separate, right? Wanting to be distinct, but not just like going off into the desert, right? Wanting to make clear distinctions, right? But just being in the world but not of the world. That phrase we've probably heard. In the world but not of the world. That's kind of your paradox thing. We are different, but we're still here, right? That kind of idea. Christ above culture. This would be like a Tertullian idea that we talked about last week, where he says, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem, right? These things are not the same, right? We don't need cultural things. We don't need to take their ideas or their thoughts or whatever. We're going to do our own thing, right? We're not going to just run away, but we're just going to do our own thing. Christ above culture is the idea of kind of like a Justin Martyr, where you take kind of the best elements of the culture, like this element is helpful, right? This logic that is in the culture, or this idea really just points to Jesus. So we're going to take that for ourselves, right? Taking the best of the culture and using it for our own kind of uses. And finally, we have Christ transformer of culture in the middle, which is kind of like the evangelical perspective, right? Like we're going to come into the culture with Christ, right? We're going to come into it, right? And we're going to interact with it, right? We're going to transform it for the good of the church and the good of the people. So that kind of idea. All right. Any questions on any of that? There's a lot there. Like most of these charts I have, or most of these spectrums, it's good to be in the middle, or not on the edges, right? The edges are normally, you don't want to be on the edges, right? The against culture, I think goes too far. Christ of culture goes too far, right? We want to be kind of in these three boxes here. So I think I'm kind of here. That's kind of where I am. But, you know. Yes, sir?
I kind of feel like we kind of do the against version a lot.
Sure.
We separate our Christian life into spiritual and secular.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, when you're doing the spiritual things, you're going to church, you're doing things for Jesus, but then, like, you switch that off and you go to work and that's secular, or you listen to some music that's secular, something like that. Whereas, like, really the God perspective is, it's like, your whole life is spiritual.
Yeah.
If there's something God's not invited you to, you just wouldn't do that thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Good point.
It needs to fit in there, and that's where like the middle is really great, because you can be in a culture, be a part of a culture in a good sense, but not interact with the negativity of that culture.
Yeah.
But where you see God, where you see pathways for God working there. But it seems like the church has always been plagued with an idea where you separate the two.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good point. Not just separating the church from the culture, but even your own personal life. Yeah. You separate the church from the culture, from your spiritual life from your non-spiritual life in your brain, right? You're just like, oh, I'm going to church, right? And this is my church time, and then you cut the line and kind of go over here, and it's like, well, that's not church time anymore, and then you just like lose that. And it's better to be like God is in all of this, right? So we even do that personally, right? Where we try to do this as an individual in our own lives. Right, and so that could be problematic. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Kelly.
Well, so I have friends that are in the art world trying to be respected and also they belong on this continuum, and maybe the transformer, like they want to share Christ with
Yeah.
artists and make an influence for Christ. But how is that different? It's just that's their jam versus the person that's in an office.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe it's more culture adjacent than office culture.
Yeah, and different industries, different communities. It's harder to be Christian in those places, like art people, right? And so you have art people who want to be Christians, but trying to fit into the art world can be very difficult because there can be a lot of differentiation. So they're trying to be above culture, right? Which is great. You know, that's good. But then how do we navigate that, right? And I think you just can't lose the script, right? You can be Justin Martyr and be like, yeah, like you can't lose the distinction, because here you lose the distinction. And I think that's the key. Right? You don't want to make that line not exist. Right? You still want that line to exist. And so trying to navigate that can be really, really difficult. And that's why we have like things like this, and we're talking about that. That's like, because this is what they were encountering, right? It was very clear. Or for example, you can be in California and be a Christian, and you can know other Christians instantaneously, right? Because if you're going to be a Christian, you're separating yourself from kind of the culture. Whereas here in Texas, it's much harder to do that, 'cause there's a lot of Christians, there's a lot of cultural Christianity, right? So some people, you're like, I don't know if they're Christian or not, right? They say, bless your heart and stuff like that, right? It's like, are you Christian? Where you would, like in California, you would never say something like that if you weren't a Christian, right? So it becomes really difficult when you're in difficult fields. You know, how do you maintain that line? How do you live in a way and fit all of that? Yeah, great point. Life. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. How do we see any biblical examples of any of this? I would say yeah, we see fairly different biblical examples, but I wouldn't necessarily say it was like a life. I mean, we have Paul, right? Paul is using kind of Stoic principles to make arguments. He's using logic, right? So he's doing above culture type things. He's going into the kind of the courtyard or the kind of the main quad of the city and being like, oh yeah, this is talking about Jesus. This person, this unknown God, this is God, right? And so he's connecting people, right? And he's doing this kind of thing. But sometimes we have other people doing more kind of separating type things, right? They'll just go off and kind of do their own thing, right? Because before that, what Paul does before he starts his ministry, he goes to the desert for like 5 years or whatever and separates himself, right? So we have kind of both of these things interplaying. And I think what the chart is very pro, kind of the center one, and that's fine, because that's kind of the idea, right? That's kind of what we want to go for. You don't want to be like always separating or always, super involved, right? You kind of need both things to come together. But I would have to do a little more research to find more specific examples. But there's stuff there, if you look for it. Yes, sir. Yeah. 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 So the idea of Christian nationalism, I'm going to hold you on that question because we're actually going to talk about something similar to that later. So, but great point. But yeah, you probably kind of above, even more of culture, I would say, depending on where you are, right? Depending on where you're putting your trust in, right? But we'll talk about that. Okay, let's keep going. So yeah, so this is the chart. Think about that. Have any questions, let me know. If you need one, we can talk about that later. I want to move and I want to talk about Augustine. Great questions, though. Let's talk about Augustine. So Augustine, or Augustine, depending on, I've heard it both ways. So Augustine is probably the most influential theologian in the church, definitely in the West, probably not in the East, but still just like ridiculously influential. One historian said, he was a dynamic and creative thinker and writer, and his influence is stamped on the thought of Western Christendom to the present. Both Roman Catholics and Protestants are, at their deepest levels, Augustinian, right? So if you are a Western Christian, you are a follower of Augustine. That's just how it is. So who is this guy? Augustine? That he is so important. Well, he was born in North Africa in a town called Tegeste in 354. Northern Africa. His mother, Monica, was a strong Christian and attempted to kind of raise him in Christian, beliefs and stuff, but was unsuccessful in doing so. Right? He was very willful, pleasure-seeking. He wanted to do his own thing, but he was also extremely intelligent. A great thinker, a great speaker. He studied rhetoric, which is kind of like speaking, right, or arguing. Who eventually moved to Carthage, which is the biggest city in northern Africa, and kind of go to school and study, and he would end up in Milan as a teacher of rhetoric and logic and these kind of things. He was a very up-and-coming scholar, very popular. He was a very popular speaker and philosopher. And he went through a number of different philosophies. He kind of started off in Manichaeism, which is kind of Gnosticism, and then he moved to kind of like Neoplatonism, which was popular. And so he kind of had this really long, elaborate journey to faith. He always kind of had this guilt for his actions, right? He was kind of going around doing all kinds of things he shouldn't be doing, and so wild ways, you could say. But he always had this guilt about it. So finally, he is converted under Ambrose, who's the bishop of Milan, became his teacher. And so one of his most popular works is an autobiographical story he calls Confessions, which is right here, Confessions. It's quite good. He writes about his conversion, and he says, "Suddenly I heard a voice of a boy or a girl, I know not which, coming from a neighboring house, chanting over and over, saying, 'Pick it up and read it, pick it up and read it, pick it up and read it.' So I quickly returned to the bench, for there I had put down the Apostles' book, Romans, when I had left there. I snatched it up, opened it, and in silence read the first paragraph on which my eyes fell. Not in rioting or drunkenness," he's reading from Romans here, "not in rioting or drunkenness, not in chambering and sexual immorality, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. I wanted to read no further, nor did I need to, for instantly, as the sentence ended, there was an infused in my heart something like the light of full certainty, and all the gloom of doubt vanished away." Right, so he has his conversion story. Right, he kind of been trying to figure all this stuff out and going through all these things, and finally his heart is changed. So what happens is he decides to return to Africa. He eventually becomes the Bishop of Hippo. He's often called Augustine of Hippo, which is a city in northern Africa. And he would live there until his death, when Vandals sieged Hippo in 450. So he lived quite a long time. Now, Augustine wrote a lot of things. A lot. He wrote so much, in fact, that even to this day, we haven't translated all of it to English. That's how much he wrote. Right? So he's written. One of my kind of professors was talking about, hey, if you want to get your PhD, you could just translate some Augustine to English, because no one's done it, right? Because that's how much stuff we have of his that he wrote. Letters and stories and writings and all this kind of stuff, right? Thousands of writings. He wrote on humanity, creation, the church, end times, biblical interpretation, original sin, predestination, free will, the sacraments, philosophy, just war theory, sexuality, teaching, soteriology, everything, right? Just all the writings. He wrote so much and for so long that he often disagrees with himself, right? Because when he started, he thought one thing, and then like 50 years later, he kind of changed his mind. So, and that's funny because when about 1,000 years later, when the Reformation happens, it basically becomes people just using, the Catholics and the Protestants just using Augustine to argue with each other, right? So it's like, well, Augustine says this. It's like, well, Augustine says this, so it's like this whole thing. So, okay, that's Augustine. Let's talk about some of his important writings. First, and it's important to know that Augustine was a Platonist. He was a follower of Plato. He liked Plato, very much like Justin Martyr before him. So that's helpful in his writings. But let's talk about Confessions. Confessions, this book right here. So Confessions, as I've already said, is an extremely important book in the history of the church. It's really kind of the first spiritual autobiography. first kind of written down testimony of a coming to faith for the purpose of evangelism and encouraging others towards repentance, right? This is for the purpose of, so he wrote it for evangelistic purposes. Written in the form of a prayer, kind of examines his thoughts and his motives on the way to his conversion. It's also an argument for the existence of original sin, which is a big hallmark of Augustine, right? That's one of the things he wrote a ton about, original sin. Key theme of his writings. And some of his most important quotes are there. My heart is restless until it rests in you. That quote is really popular. You might have heard that one. So Confessions is really good. And if you're going to read any Augustine, read Confessions. It's real readable because it's just him talking about how he feels about things. So highly recommended. Next thing, City of God is his next one. Confessions, City of God. So, City of God is a response to something that happened in history. The city of Rome was actually sacked by the Visigoths in 410, right? And so, as we talked about before, and this is kind of where I want to piggyback off what John said, is at this time, Rome and the church were together, right? So the Roman Empire was the Christian Empire, right? They were the same thing. So when Rome got sacked, it was like the city of God was sacked. It was like God failed, right? The Christianity is done, right? We failed, right? Because those two things, Rome and the church, were so connected by this point. Right? It's been 100 years since Edict of Milan, and so much so that the Roman Empire is now the kingdom of God, kingdom of Rome, right? They're connected. So people were distraught when Rome was sacked, right? They were broken. The church didn't know what to do. So in response, Augustine writes this book, right? He wrote City of God book, and it reminds the church that Rome is not the city of God, right? Whatever empire, whatever country, whatever place you're in, that's not the kingdom of God, right? The kingdom of God is yet to come. The city of God is eternal, right? All these our cities are temporal, man-made. They're not God's city, right? God's city is eternally good, like God is, right? So he's reminding people of what the truth is, right? And not get stuck here. And so this is what happens, right? We see that, and we see this. This is not a new problem, right? All throughout time, that people will connect, especially Christian countries, right? When the Christianity is the standard, everyone is Christian. It's like mandated, right? They will connect, like the Crusades. We have this exact same thing, right? Where we go in, the Christians need to take back the Holy Land, right? This idea, right? Uniting kind of country and faith as one entity. And we'll see this all throughout time. And so this is what Augustine's talking about, is like these are not the same thing. And I think this is encouraging for us too, because we can do the same thing, right? No matter where you are on the political spectrum with the kind of elections happening, there's always this idea of like, oh, we're screwed if X or Y gets elected or doesn't. It's like, remember Augustine, like, whatever. Like, this is not the city of God, right? The city of God is yet to come, right? The perspective needs to be a heavenly perspective, not a worldly perspective. And so that's kind of the main thrust. He talks about a bunch of stuff. It's long. But that's the main thrust of City of God. So, all right. Next, writings against the Manichaeans. If I can spell that at all. Manichaeans. Writings against the Manichaeans. So he originally was in this camp before he converted for a time. And like most of his writings, a lot of his writings are addressing controversies at the time, heresies at the time. So he liked to argue a lot, as they did in that time. And one of the biggest heresies at the time was the Manichaeans. And they were basically kind of Gnostics, right? So Gnostics, Manichaeans are spiritual good, physical bad, right? That's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the idea, right? And so he's writing against this idea. Right? So he's writing for the idea that the physical is not inherently evil, right? That God created the world good, right? The physical as good, and then man sinned, right? And so that ties into his original sin idea. So he's fighting against the Manichaeans. It's important of his writings. Next, we have writings against Pelagius. Oh. Pelagius. Pelagius was a British theologian, and he was really concerned with the kind of the sinfulness of the Roman Christians, this kind of like free grace right? If original sin exists, then we can kind of just do whatever we want, kind of a thing. So Pelagius was reacting against what he saw, and started to say that original sin didn't really exist, right? We were created good, and you're defiling yourself by doing these things. And so Augustine argues against him for the inherited sin of original sin, to kind of prove this biblical truth that no, we are sinners, right? We find ourselves in sin. Adam sinned, and we inherit that sin, right? And so he argues against Pelagius or Pelagianism, and eventually he kind of wins. The church kind of goes against Pelagius and kind of condemns him, and so this is very common, right? We see a lot of Pelagianism today, right? That people are generally good, right? This is what the society thinks a lot of times, right? People are generally good, right? And that's not true. So this is an important, relevant thing that we still deal with all the time today. All right. I think that's it. Questions on Augustine? Augustine? No? Okay. Very important. All right. Cool. Any other questions on anything? No, we're good? All right, come see me. That's all I have for today. If you have questions or need something. I appreciate all of you coming and hanging out, listening to me prattle on. We will see you next week. I appreciate it. Have a good one.